Now, dear students, today we are going to discuss what are the bones which are forming the nasal cavity, especially the lateral wall of the nose. Now, this is the hemisection of the skull. Here we can easily examine or see what are the bones which are forming the lateral wall of nasal cavity. So, there are outer opening of the nasal cavity which is known as the anterior nares. So in this specimen it will be that this is the level of the anterior nares by which the nasal cavity, this is the nasal cavity which is opening towards the outer side, while posteriorly there is the posterior nares, that is the opening which is leading from the nasal cavity into the nasopharynx. So this is the whole is the lateral wall of the nose. If we start the bones from anterior to posterior side, this is the first bone which is moving. It is the nasal bone which is the forming the lateral wall. Just behind that you can see this bone. This is the frontal process of maxilla, and behind the frontal process we can see this bone. It is a small bone, lacrimal bone, which is forming a canal, nasolacrimal duct, opening into the inferior meatus of the nasal cavity. Now just behind that lacrimal bone we can see this large bone. This is the ethmoid bone. Superiorly the ethmoid bone is having the cribriform plate, and then it gives rise to this uncinate process below. This is the uncinate process, and this area you can see it is also the ethmoid bone, but it is known as the labyrinth of the ethmoid bone. So labyrinth is carrying a number of spaces in it. So there are a number of spaces in the labyrinth which are known as the ethmoidal ear cells. We divide the ethmoidal ear cells into three parts depending upon the location: anterior ethmoidal ear cell, middle ethmoidal ear cells, and posterior ethmoidal ear cells. If we go posteriorly, you can see this cavity. This is the sphenoidal ear cell sinus. It is one of the paranasal ear sinus, and it is single. Mostly it is a single, only one sphenoidal ear sinus is present. Now below that this is the fourth bone in the lateral wall which is forming the lateral wall. It is the fourth bone behind the ethmoid bone. This is the perpendicular plate of palatine bone. So where is the palatine bone? So palatine bone, it is having two parts. This is the horizontal plate and this is the perpendicular plate. Horizontal plate, it leads to the formation of a posterior part of the hard palate, while the perpendicular plate, it is contributing to the formation of the lateral wall of the nose. Now just behind the perpendicular plate there is another bone which is the medial pterygoid plate. This is the medial pterygoid plate, and you know it is a part of the sphenoid bone. So how many bones we have discussed? We can revise it again. So if we start from the front side, it is the nasal bone. First bone is the nasal bone. Second is this is the second bone, which is the frontal process of maxilla. Then third bone is this lacrimal bone. Behind the lacrimal bone, this whole bone is the ethmoid bone, uncinate process, and labyrinth of the ethmoid bone. Superiorly, there is the perpendicular, this is the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, and behind the ethmoid bone you can see this part having this foramen. This is the sphenopalatine foramen which is present within the perpendicular plate, and most posterior bone which is forming the lateral wall of the nasal cavity is the medial pterygoid plate, and below you can see this is the pterygoid hamulus. That is the posterior border of the medial pterygoid plate. You know it is forming the pterygoid hamulus. So these are the bones which are forming the lateral wall of the nose.